Hi everyone, and welcome to Mod 3.6b. Today we're going to be talking about social emotional development across the lifespan. Here is your learning objectives and here is your vocab. So we're going to talk about Erik Erikson, and this is one of the key stage theorists that we are going to talk about. We have already talked about Jean Piaget and his cognitive stages. So this is Erik Erikson and his 8 psychosocial stages. The stages go from birth to end of life, and each social stage focuses on an important social task. So it's going to say issue at the top, and then it's going to say something versus something. And that's what you should remember, is that age range is dealing with this social task, and they're either going to come out with the one side of the verses or the negative outcome, the second side of the verses. So here's the full chart if you wanted to take it in your notes this way, but I'm going to have a slide for each of these. So the first stage we've already talked about when we talked about attachment theories. We talked about the stage from 0 to 1.5 years old, that is trust versus mistrust. So in this stage, the child is trying to determine if the world is a safe and trusting place. Are my needs being met is the essential question. You'll notice there's a question for each one. So if their needs are being met, when they're cold, someone's making them warm, if they're tired, someone's helping them fall asleep, if they're hungry, someone's feeding them, then they build that secure base, right? The world is a trusting place. It is reliable. I can safely go off and do the next thing because I have that secure trust. So each one builds on the next one. So if you build that secure trust that the world is a safe place, then you can build into stage 2. This is toddlerhood, so from age 1 to 3 years old. So think toddler ages. And autonomy doesn't mean independence. It means I can do something for myself. So that is the key question for this stage. Can I do things for myself? Autonomy is something like I can put my socks on by myself. I can put my shoes on. I can pour my own bowl of goldfish, right? This is, am I capable of doing something on my own? Does everything have to be done for me? So the negative outcome would make a child feel like there's nothing I can do. And there are things that parents can do to foster this, right? When appropriate, to give them those opportunities to try and to struggle and to spill a little of the goldfish outside of the bowl, and that's okay, or to mess up the first time they try to put on their shoe and need a little bit of help, right? But also learn how to do it on their own. So fostering these at each stage, parents can make a little bit an influence here. So after that toddler stage and you're ending up kindergarten, now you're going into elementary school and you are working on initiative versus guilt. Can I lead others and make decisions? So I'm sorry, I had that wrong. This is toddlerhood. Now we're going into preschool, ending at kindergarten. Okay. Initiative versus guilt. Can I lead others and make decisions? So think about preschool, think about kindergarten. This is, can I ask that other kid over there if he wants to play blocks with me? If I'm playing with that other kid playing blocks, can I suggest an idea of something we can build together? Can I ask my parents, hey, can we go back to the zoo? Right? So it's the taking initiative. They're really, as their name suggests. So having that secure base, you can see how that builds. Each thing is building. I can do things on my own. Now can I include others in what I do on my own? Now we're in elementary school. So 6 to 11 years old, industry versus inferiority. Am I capable of doing things well? So if successful, the child is going to learn that they're good at something. It doesn't mean that they have to be good at everything they do, but something that their culture, something that the adults around them have identified as to, wow, you're really good at playing soccer. You're really good at art. You're really a great helper to family and friends and teachers. It's something that is valued. So once they have figured that out, now we're in teenhood. So 12 to 20 years old. And this is identity versus role confusion. Who am I? And this is the job of 12 to 20-year-olds, Erikson says, is to figure out and try on different hats and kind of like play different parts, maybe depending on which group of people they're with, and figuring out who you truly are, so that in the next stage 6, we can express that to someone else. So maybe it's changing fashion or changing like friend groups or activities that the person does, but figuring out who I am. And we're going to talk more about that. There's a lot of extra info in the book about this stage and the next stage and the next couple stages, actually. Emerging adulthood, we've already mentioned. So after or at the end of that identity versus role confusion, 20. So somewhere between like 18 to mid 20s, people in Western cultures are typically in what we now call emerging adulthood, where they are still dependent on their parents financially, social, emotionally, perhaps, but they don't have full independence yet. And as you can see here, it's that time period is expanding as time has progressed. What is true in 2026 looked a lot different in the 1880s. Okay, so the next stage is young adulthood. So that we know that means 20s to 40s. And this is, now that I figured out who I am, can I share who I am with another person? And this is intimacy. This doesn't have to mean that it is a romantic relationship. Intimacy, forming close, loving, open relationships with another person can also be friends. It has to be people that you are disclosing your full self to now that you know who that is. So people could have many romantic relationships and be in a state of isolation because they're not really being truly intimate. They're not fully disclosing. And self-disclosure is an important part of connectedness to other people and to happiness and to love. And we'll talk more about that. Stage 7, so now we're in middle adulthood, so 40s to 60s. Now that we've done all that for ourselves, can I contribute to society? Can I pass things down in a meaningful way so that I can leave the world a better place? So perhaps that's like training the younger doctors and helping them become great doctors. Maybe it's changing something in your organization to leave it better than it was. Maybe it's your own children in your own community or your own school system, but leaving things better than they were. And stage 8, so our last stage is 60s plus, late adulthood. Can I reflect on my life and feel satisfaction? This does not mean that the person feels like they made no mistakes. It means that they feel satisfied and fulfilled with their life. Integrity versus despair. Okay, so let's go back to the identity versus role confusion. There's a whole bunch of stuff in the book, and I thought some of this stuff would be interesting. Also, this first one is a vocab. So, social identity. When we are figuring out the who am I and identity versus role confusion, the social identity plays a role in that. And so this is who we are, so we being our in-groups, and our self-concept. So the part of the answer that comes from group identity. And group identities tend to be formed by how we are different from those around us. So whatever those labels are that you can put on yourself, who am I, that tend to stand out perhaps or be unique about you from those around you, become part of your social identity. Some people form this early on, adopting their parents' values, like a familial identity, and some people, this happens later. Some people come from a multicultural background, and maybe parents coming from various different cultures, and so they are the ones to kind of weave and integrate and determine what aspects of that are them in all of them, and how, if all of them, how do they integrate to get together, right, to make you. So for some people, this is a more complex process and it takes longer or happens later. Some people it happens earlier on. Some more notes about identity. So in this stage, so talking about mental health now, early on in identity versus role confusion, so around 12 years old, self-esteem tends to fall in those early years, depression scores, particularly for girls, increases. And we do see that bounce back. So self-esteem increases in the late teens and early 20s. And when we look at the big 5 personality traits, we also notice the trend of agreeableness and emotional stability increasing later in those teen years as well. Teen and depression and suicide rates have also been correlated recently to social media spreading and being consumed more by teens. So what about parents and peers? So we notice that attachment changes at around this puberty time, at this identity time, where even before this, where peers are more embarrassed by their parents and more focused on trying to fit in. And so some interesting things here is that when viewing, so on social media, when viewing liked photos, teen brains become more active in their reward processing areas, and this leads to more imitation. In a more liked video, more liked photo compared to a less liked photo. So meaning like the photo that has more likes, you're more likely to imitate. Accents and slang, that comes from peers. So children get their culture from their peers. Not that they can't integrate some of their parents' culture, but especially in terms of language, and in terms of some behavior. So teens who vape and drink typically have peers who have modeled that behavior. So you kind of are who you hang around with. And part of this is that process of like, there's a term for it, selective something that you don't need to know, but it's part of this process of like, maybe I don't want to be that kind of person. I don't want to hang out with this person because that's not really me, right? So figuring out who you are also figures out who you want to hang out with. And teens who feel close to parents tend to do better in school. These are all going to be, so this is a bunch of correlations in this. And so we don't know cause effect on that. So does parenting matter? Yes, parenting matters. Most of the time it's in those extreme cases. So like, for example, neglect and abuse can really have an impact, right? But in a survey of nearly 6,000 teens in 10 countries, from Australia to Bangladesh to Turkey, most said they like their parents. And they tend to argue with their parents over mundane issues like homework, like, curfews, things like that. And they tend to argue more so with the firstborn, and more so it tends to be the mom. So they don't tend to argue as much about big things, values, or big decisions like college choices, things like that. It's not that it doesn't happen. We're just talking statistics here. And then there's a whole thing about how parenting expectations differ by culture. And there are some examples here about how parenting choices tend to be beneficial to the child in that particular culture. So if the culture values something, for example, like not talking back or being very respectful of elders, then that is very pronounced in the raising of that child because it's the parent's value, and it's also they're trying to instill that this thing is very important. So it's really important. The takeaway here from this part of the textbook was not to assume one way of parenting is better than another, because we are prepping our child for the culture that they live in a lot of those times. And then personality measures reveal that shared environmental influences from the womb onward typically account for less than 10% of a children's differences. Meaning, parents can relax. They don't have a lot of control over who their child is. Their child is who they are. And do you have influence? Yes. If you're able to, there's some things that you can pick. Like peers have influence, and you can sometimes pick who the peers are. You can pick the school. You can pick the neighborhood if you have that degree of privilege. So there are other ways, right? I said like being being forming positive relationships. They do better in school. So does it matter? Yes. But in terms of those personality traits, you are who you are. So social clock. This is the culturally preferred time that we do certain significant life events. So for example, culturally preferred time to get married, culturally preferred time to have children. In Western cultures, we tend to put some of these social clock things on hold as we are focused on education. The average, and so you can see that in the average age of marriage increasing more than 5 years since the 1960s. So that's an example of that. This was an interesting study where they asked people to say 5 times, you have to fill it in with something different, I am blank. Teens tend to fill that blank in with individual traits. But when we get to this young adulthood stage where we're talking about a lot of these social clock events, young adults tend to fill it in with their social roles. So they'll fill it in with a career title, or they'll fill it in with a caregiver role, or a marriage identity, or being a parent, things like that. So these differences that we see in the identity stage of 12 to 20 versus the young adulthood stage tend to be created by these significant life events. Career, marriage, children, death of loved ones, etc. So now we're going to continue to look at that young adulthood stage. And so they do a whole thing in the textbook about marriage and how that plays a social role in our lives. So adult relationships are seen to be more satisfying when they share values, interests, and they self-disclose to each other. Expectations in a spouse over generations have increased over time. So before, the expectation might have been financial stability and respect, and now it's wage earner, caregiver, intimate friend, warm, responsive, equitable partner, and household chore. There are higher expectations now. We still see statistically that there is vow power, which means that those that get married are more likely to stay in that relationship. That relationship is more likely to last. And that's particularly true if they marry at age 20, over age 20, and if the people are well educated. All of this is correlational information, right? So this next stuff. So higher rates of divorce are among those who live together before marriage. So some examples of some other factors here is that those that get married, those that live together before marriage might be less committed to an enduring marriage, meaning marriage has to be forever, than those who don't live together before marriage. They might be less marriage supporting while living with the other person, and they might be more likely to marry someone that they wouldn't otherwise marry because they're already living together, and so that makes things more entangled and more difficult and almost in some ways easier. So there's a lot of correlational complexities to the statistics, but 9 in 10 adults in the United States say that they have either been married, or they want to be married. In a large US study with 60,000 people, the top reason 93% people say to marry is love. And marriage is a predictor of our happiness, of our mental and physical health, and our income. There's all sorts of studies on having a good marriage, having a positive, intimate relationship, right? Where you're self-disclosing, where you're being supportive, and positive outcomes to that. Here are some more positive outcomes. Here's some this is a predictor outcome, actually. So relationships that tend to last, they have 5 times more smiling at each other, touching, laughing, complimenting each other, rather than being sarcastic or critical. So it's a 5-to-1 ratio of positive interactions that seems to make the difference. So they say that if you really want to predict who's going to last, don't look for, it's not about like passionate love, because passionate love is that initial stage of relationships anyways, but look for how they treat each other, right? So relationships that, so people get married, they might want to have kids, and having children can be, and statistically is pointed out to be in the textbook, this moment of overwhelming joy and love for your child like no other. And this is all data collected according to a national survey. But as time goes on, children do use your time, they use your money, they use your emotional energy, and there might be some like negative impact on the relationship itself. But what can make the biggest difference in that is creating an equitable relationship. So when we see the negative impact on the relationship and the pressures and the negative associations, it tends to be with working mothers. So the more equitable the relationship is, the more everyone's involved in parenting and household chores. This not only improves outcomes for the child, it also improves outcomes for the relationship. And then also important to know is the empty nest idea. So a lot of people think that when the child leaves, the parents are going to just be sad. Parents might feel sad, and it's a difficult event when the event happens when the child does leave and go off to college. But the outcomes are that parents end up being happy being empty nesters. Okay, so does well-being change across the lifespan? So here's some more research on this. So now we're looking at older adulthood. So when asked what they would have done differently if they could relive their life, it was, I wish I took this trip, or I wish I studied harder in school. It was less on mistakes and more like, I wish I did this thing that I never got to do. So positive feelings were supported by enhanced emotional control later in adulthood. So we tend to have more positive feelings and we have more emotional control. We tend to let negative things kind of fall off. We tend to forget them more easily and remember the good more easily. The amygdala responds less to the negative events. So we see this in our brain's activity, but they're still responding to those positive ones. And then here's a chart showing you just the difference. Percentage of Americans reporting a lot of stress-free enjoyment and happiness the previous day. So death, dealing with death. What range of reactions does a loved one's death trigger? So in terms of stage theories for grieving, there are no predictable stages that are going to look identical for people. Another thing that comes up with death is that people believe that if a person isn't grieving the right way, again, there are no proper stages for grieving, but if people aren't grieving a certain way, if they don't let it out right in the beginning, or if they do let it out right in the beginning, it's going to be easier later. And that's not true. There is no like, I can just purge it out in the beginning and then it's going to make things easier later. There was a note about a statistic that parents that lose a child, if one parent tries to stay strong for the other parent, meaning not grieve and not talk about the loss, that actually can be something that can negatively impact the grieving process. So trying to do something to help someone else by not expressing your feelings of grief actually isn't helpful to that person and can actually have a negative impact. Can therapy be helpful? Can support groups be helpful? Absolutely. But what we also know is that the strongest correlation to people doing better with grief is the passage of time, unfortunately. Is impending death terrifying? So there's tons of research on people experiencing impending death, and it is less terrifying than what we imagine. So they are not as overwhelmed. They're not as terrified overall. than what people tend to think how they will feel. So takeaways. So remember those Erik stages. If they're unresolved stages, then they're going to carry that thing. If they're mistrusting the world, they're going to carry that into autonomy, shame versus doubt. It's going to be harder to get that next stage successfully. So each stage builds on the next one. Parents play an important role, but so do peers. Parents bring values, beliefs. Peers bring social norms, clothing, language, accents. There is still vow power. People tend to get married later, focus more on education in Western cultures, and things change culturally over time. And older people are more happy and they're emotionally more stable. So that sums up our Mod 3.6b, and I will see you in class. Thanks.